My honor and pleasure to be here with Dr. Wendy Zierler, who serves as the Sigmund Falk Professor of Modern Jewish Literature and Feminist Studies at the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion. Thanks for taking the time.
So nice to be here.
Thank you. So some questions about your recent interest and work on poetry and prayer. To start, how can poetry as a mode of aesthetic expression serve as prayer? And what examples can be brought of this from traditional liturgy and from contemporary practice?
So when one thinks about poetry, I've been sort of developing this analogy. Think about the relationship that poetry has with language in relation to the relationship that prayer has to life or experience. Mm-hmm. So poetry, if we think about an aesthetically attuned, heightened awareness of language, an awareness of language where language communicates, but it always hides or intimates or suggests just as much as it reveals. Mm-hmm. That it is not this straightforward, easily encapsulated way of speaking, but it intimates that every question or every experience has at its background a kind of higher, deeper, more attuned level. Mm-hmm. So the extent to which you want your prayer experience to take you to a heightened appreciation of life, its wonder, its mystery, its hidden or maybe not yet understood aspects. So poetry as a kind of use of language that's exquisitely attuned to experiences, that tries to bring together disparate elements in the way that metaphor does, right? Mm-hmm. Metaphor always assumes that you can learn something about an experience that you've already had by comparing this experience to something totally mm-hmm. other. Right? That through that you might find out something about it, mm-hmm. experience that wouldn't be immediately self-evident. Mm-hmm. And you hope that in prayer, given that your prayer is an effort to come into a relationship or have an encounter with something ineffable, never entirely comprehended, that it needs that approach to language. So I'm coming to this actually not primarily as a poetry scholar. Mm-hmm. I'm engaged in this with an expert in poetry, a scholar at the University of Utah named Ira Schreiber, who's written a few books only on poetry. Yeah. I've written some on poetry, but lately I've been much more involved in prose, in creative fiction writing. Mm-hmm. But I come to that experience. For me, I can compare what it's like to live life as a scholar, where I'm reading for content and for knowledge bites that I can give over to my students, as opposed to the way I read as a fiction writer. Yeah. Or I'm learning all the mysteries, the quiet, close attention to the sound of the language and the way I can make language bring out things that I hadn't immediately expected, or that it would have another valence. That to me is a similar approach to language.
So I wonder, is this approach only for poets and scholars? Because when I think of prayer, I think of one of the largest barriers people have already is language. The language is already so complex. If it's in Hebrew, certainly for Americans, but also just the complexity of traditional prayer. So is your sense that the common person, so to speak, can also find meaning in poetry as prayer?
So our interest in this is coming from the fact that the common person, at least in the liberal Jewish world of the past few years, has felt the need to have poetry in their daily prayer. Okay. That while traditional prayer has poetry, has always had poetry, so much of the prayer is from Tehillim, from the Book of Psalms, or from medieval Hebrew poetry, or even earlier, that understanding of what is poetic is dated and doesn't speak to them as much. Right. But activating the poetic realm is something that Jews who have been estranged from prayer seem to accept and take as axiomatic. The problem is that so many liberal prayer books in the United States now include poems which either are kind of de facto Yehuda Amichai, or too facile poetry that would not pass muster among poets. Whereas in Israel, where there is this flourishing piyut movement, and where in liberal prayer circles, if you consider, for example, Beit Tfilah Yisraeli in the Tel Aviv Namal, it is so completely accepted that there will be Israeli poetry that has made its way into the song repertoire and Israeli culture and that sort of thing. They know that they have to have some way to access the poetic realm so they can pray. And not that all prayer cannot be only poetry. I spoke to Esteban Gottfried, who's the rabbi of Beit Tfilah Yisraeli, and I talked to him about the Siddur that they've developed over the years, and he said to have prayer only be poetry, it would be like having a cake that was only made out of icing. So you can't only have that super elevated language. The Amidah, for example, is pretty straightforward. When our praise and our petition and our thanks, the language is it may not be lowest common denominator prose, but it is not beyond the prose canon. Right. So what you need is some careful mixture of the innovation and the familiar.
It also seems to me, correct me if I'm wrong, that poetry has a greater potential than prose for cultivating awe, cultivating a sense of wonder and mystery. It's sort of a different level of abstraction. Right, that which feels to me what some long for in the prayer experience is not just to reaffirm faith or belief in XYZ dogma, but actually to tap into something larger.
So absolutely. Now, for me, there are a number of elements. Some of it has to do with just not using the same sort of Twitter language or stripped down chit chat of the mundane world. If language is one of the ways in which human beings distinguish themselves, then language has to express itself in a different way in the prayer context. But the notion that in facing God, that you use such a straightforward language, and that is going to take you to some ineffable place. That also seems to be wrong-headed. So you need to have the opportunity for that difficult language to be somewhat limited in the amount of it there, so that you can actually read it and consider it. The musicality of poetry is important. There's a reason why so many poems lend themselves to being put to song, and being, the rhythm matters, repetitions matter, being able to create a familiarity through the mnemonic that comes with the lyric, that also helps. And so, there are many things that get you to a prayer place, and it might be silence, and it might be a certain kind of movement. That's why people shuffle. But if language is one of those, then the language has to be taken seriously. And we live in a really prose-oriented time. And where we can't even rely on written prose being read. It's kind of, words are spoken, and they're abstracted, and they come out in bits, and they're meant to disclose meaning. And so if we want to be able to enter into a different mindset, so then we have to take up a different approach to language.
What can be said about the interplay in prayer of the familiar versus the unfamiliar or poetically defamiliarized?
Okay. So
In other words, can poetry serve to defamiliarize well-known prayers in the interest of renewing one's spiritual practice? Or conversely, is it important, even crucial in prayer, to maintain a good deal of familiarity?
Okay, so I'll quote here again Esteban Gottfried, who I think has thought a lot about this. He and I had this very interesting conversation, and I talked to him about what makes his prayer services that include so much poetry, what makes them authentic prayer and not just some kind of spectacle where people watch people perform interesting aesthetic things, but they're spectators. And he talks about the 80-20 ratio, that in effect, prayer has this combination of nostalgia and renewal, so a tapping into what's familiar and getting back into that familiar place, and also finding a way to renew yourself, to believe that every day God renews you in the world. And so you need to be able to rely on that 80% familiarity. But 20% people can handle having their worldview defamiliarized. And so what good literature aims to do is to take everyday experience but cast it in a different light so that suddenly you take a special notice in a way that you hadn't before because you're just walking around in a haze, and that's not what what your experience is lending itself to.
Yeah.
So that 20% can be the place where you bring in a poem that had not been there before, or you do, and you juxtapose it. The way their Siddur is set up is so you always have the traditional prayer on the right and the neo on the left, and they're in a dialogue with one another, and they're even speaking with one another.
Yeah.
And that way, you're believing that it matters that you show up that day. Your showing up that day is not just a replication of what's happened the day before, although in some respects it is. And just showing up is an attainment.
Right.
But you kind of hope that something new happens each day too.
Yeah. Well, one of my favorite midot, character traits from the Musar tradition, is hitlamdut, that we're constantly in a process of curiosity, of discovery, of finding. And I think that a lot of that's been lost from the tefillah, from the prayer culture. That sense of being in a learning experience, in a curious stage, as opposed to just the devotional. There's a place for the devotional, but just sort of the repetitious devotional experience as opposed to a moment of discovery.
Well, in some cases, like a poem can be a kavanah that gets you into that place where the thing that you do all the time as a daily devotion suddenly is presented in a new frame. Or words that you always said, they kind of fizz and they crackle for you, in ways that poetry tries to make language sound and crack and pop out.
Yeah. Have you yourself participated in or read about services in which contemporary poetry has been effectively incorporated into worship services? And what strategies can you envision for such practices?
So I am constantly involved in these services because my students are enjoying to be creative in the tefillah that they originate. And when you're in an environment that's not insisting on a halakhic structure, so you're given the license to be able to innovate. And so I have one student who did an entire prayer service where he included the ptichot and the chatimot, so the introductions and the conclusions of the standard brachot in shacharit, but then as the meat in the middle, he chose modern poems. And so everyone knew that there was a structure that came from ages, that studied and true, but they knew that they were also going to be experiencing something that was other than that they ever encountered. Now, he himself notes that because no one knows what's coming, the prayer leader is kind of holding all the cards, and so it limits the ability of everyone else to be participating in that enfranchised way. What I think I've seen as maybe more replicable, something that could be more of a regular practice, is what they do in the Namal, where there are standard songs that you're going to encounter, or standard tefillot that you're going to encounter, so you can sink back into that place where you don't have to be kind of sitting at the edge of your chair wondering what's going to happen. And yet you might be called to experience something you haven't experienced before.
What about poetry as protest? In the sense of, we're mostly talking about poetry as a form of communication with God or as a form of prayer. But what about poetry as a religious experience for social connection and for even some sort of subversive component of polemics, against society or against societal structures? Is that merely a secular activity, or could there be a place for a poetry as prayer, as a version of protest, or as a version of social experience?
Well, I think that one can easily turn to prophetic literature and see, we have haftarot that are meant to serve that exact purpose,
right.
But we've become so as distant from their meaning and near them. They need to be defamiliarized for us either through people doing English readings that precede them, or some sort of orientation.
Right.
It would seem to me.
Speaking of that, I saw one of my colleagues. He acted out one of the Psalms, And it radically changed my understanding of it. Because you read it, you're like, okay, it's kind of intense language, but this happened, this happened. And when he acted out and brought it to life, it was the only time I'd ever seen it. It totally changed the way I read it. So I think you're right. Actually doing readings or actually acting it out, I think is a...
Yeah, I mean, that the same can be said about Tehillim.
Yeah.
I believe it's Psalm 40. I recently heard Shai Held give a wonderful talk about that as one of the most strident protest poems, saying what Job would have said if he hadn't been silenced at the end of that book.
Interesting. Okay, but I cut you off a moment ago.
I don't know that you cut me off. I think that in many respects, all of what we're talking about has been anticipated by what traditional liturgy did. It's just that we're, anything that's said and mumbled for so many centuries. We become distant from its original meaning. So we can find beautiful examples of poetry as prayer or prayer poetry in the Siddur, but we don't, generally speaking, highlight them in the way that we pray.
Right.
And interestingly enough, in liberal Siddurim, some of those prayers, for example, Nishmat, which has, if my mouth were... It were filled with song like the sea, it filled with a string of similes that doesn't appear in many, it doesn't often get used in many liberal.
Yeah, so, it's an amazing concept you're saying, because I think so many of the traditional structures are actually about stepping back from the road. If you think of Shabbat, stepping away from the week to reimagine how we operate in the world, or to some degree a fast day, stepping away from our food to think about ethical consumption more deeply. Or even nidah, thinking about sexual relationships and how we remove ourselves at times to return to it differently. So too, what does it look like to step away from prayer as we know it and be stimulated in some new way and return to it in some reinvigorated way? And maybe it'll be altered, what we return to. But, okay, my last question for you. Can you talk a little bit about your upcoming book, Movies and Midrash, which sounds fascinating, the origin of this work, and how you see the relevance of secular film to the study of Jewish text and belief?
I'm happy to talk about that. So that book is the result of a many-year collaboration with an elder colleague of mine, Eugene Borowitz, who is a preeminent theologian at Hebrew Union College, who approached me when I was just a starting professor at HUC to teach a course with him. The idea behind the course was that we should use culture that was out there. Ideas and cultural experiences that people were having anyway as a way of reaching the Jews in the pews, and using it as a way of a springboard to bring it back to a distinctly Jewish conversation. He had done that earlier in the heyday of Saul Bellow and Philip Roth, trying to reach synagogue Jews around the great American Jewish writers at that time, and it seemed to him that we had moved out of the novel age and we were in the world of film. And so for many years we taught this course, and the idea behind it is based on a principle that we developed, or a reading method called inverted midrash. The idea being that in regular, a common feature of midrash is that when the rabbis are offering an exegesis of a verse, they, after they give the one or two or three different interpretations of the verse, they still feel that they've not exhausted the possibilities, and they say, Mashal mahadavar domeh, a parable to what can it be likened, and they tell a story. So it's usually they move from the verse to the broad culture or medium of the folktale. And what we did is we moved from the broad culture or medium of film back to the verse. And so we would do careful, attentive, close readings of cultural works, appreciating them in their own terms, and taking the time to take them apart and not let them wash over us unthinkingly. So to recreate that experience so that film should not just be recreation, but it should be a kind of interpretation through recreation. Another term that I developed around this is the idea of recreative alienation. Gene Borowitz talked about the need for us Jews to be creatively alienated from culture. The way that we express our distinct, particular prophetic function is to participate in culture, but also at moments carefully distance ourselves so that we can reflect on what Judaism has to say on that particular issue. So once we've done that careful attentive reading, we then say, well, what does Judaism say about
Right.
this? Through a close reading of a central Jewish text, or midrash, or so it might be a biblical work, it might be something in rabbinic literature.
Yeah. It feels to me like the next manifestation, I don't know if you would talk about it this way, the next manifestation of the Hasidic desire to find truth in everything, to see sparks of light in everything, and to see Torah as all encompassing. The sense of watching films or reading secular books that, like you said, there's some alienation that's there, but ultimately it can spark higher revelation, or if not revelation, higher insights into when we return to our material.
So part of this is out of an awareness that we should be integrated religious personalities. Right. Also, this is an effort to bring a Jewish voice to a long-standing Christian conversation for many years.
Nice.
And many books later. Christians have been involved in trying to make the argument that cinema is not just cinema with an S-I-N-E-M-A, but recognizing that instead of being at church on Sunday, many people were at movies, and so necessarily themes that were also present in religious discourse were being presented in film, and so they ought to seize that opportunity. But many of those readings went in a Christian or at best a universalist ecumenical place, and we felt that we had a reason to want to be unapologetically Jewish in this, that we wanted to find an occasion not just to see that film also treats the theme of truth, and that would be the end point, but from then declare an investment in what Judaism particularly has to say about this.
Yeah, love it. Be sure to check out Dr. Wendy Zierler's many books online, and continue to learn from her wonderful work. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much.
Wonderful.